Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Interesting topic today. Let's go for it. Redditors who have known murderers or rapists or other hardened criminals. What were they like, and how did you react to finding out? Please remember to like, share your own story, and subscribe. I've known a few murderers and rapists through work. I mean, nothing much to talk about really. I remember being 18 and visiting jail for a school project and talking to a guy who killed his mother and lived with her corpse for about a week. Always struck me how boring and very human he looked. Up until that point, I'd figured that something so intense, even if it was violent and gruesome, would somehow impart some form of wisdom in you. Nope. Turns out you're still a regular human being, probably very bland and boring. Only that, plus you killed someone. Makes me believe pretty much anyone can be a killer if the conditions are right. Insanely creepy teacher who made every girl in middle school uncomfortable continued to be creepy for years, locking us suddenly in rooms in the dark without warning, asking us to meet him to pick up papers for homework or projects in empty classrooms right at the end of the school day, then offering to drive us home. No one in the school administration listened to any reports. And the principal even said that no one who was actually a predator would be this obvious about it. That the teacher was a genius, and that sometimes geniuses are awkward or lack social insight. Anyway, now he's in jail for multiple counts of child abuse. Whoever could have guessed, besides every girl at school. A kid who me and my best friend used to infrequently hang out with turned out to be a murderer, stabbed his ex-girlfriend about 40 times because he was so upset they broke up. Finding that out was horrifying, but honestly not surprising. He always seemed kind of off when he was younger. My father had a work friend for years. I only ever knew him as a hard-working, nice guy with a good sense of humor. He'd had dinner with us many times, and he was a good friend of the family. Years later, I was reading a book by a local author about the criminal history of my area, and I came across a bit about a grisly murder with 3 suspects and only 2 convictions. This guy was the 3rd suspect, but dodged the charges. I asked my father about it, and he confirmed it was true. I asked what he thought, and he told me that the chances were pretty good he was involved based on his history. He wouldn't have stood out in the crowd to any reason I could think of. This kid used to hang out with some dudes at a mall I'd hang out with. Didn't know him that well. He was in his late teens or early 20s and was selling cell phones. He gave me a good deal on a Nokia 7110. I traded in a 6110 and 2 vibrating batteries. He actually had to hound me for those as we made the exchange without the vibrating batteries, and I was taking my sweet time handing them over. My friends warned me not to jack this kid around. I wasn't being malicious or a prick, just lazy. And he had killed her mom for the inheritance and buried her in the woods outside the city. This was before you could Google shit like this properly, but I never believed them. His mom was a semi-famous actress, and this shit would be all over the news. Turned out, a few weeks later it was all true. He hired some guy who worked in a tire shop a few blocks from where I lived, invited him over, put on headphones while the tire shop guy strangled his mom. Then they cut her corpse up in the bathtub and took it out to the woods. Then he took a train to a lake and texted himself from his mom's phone, pretending that the mom was still alive. He did get caught and jailed for an ungodly amount of time. As for how I saw him, he seemed like a good enough dude. Decent business, kind of an intense character, yeah. I've told this story on here before, but prior to age 5, I lived next to this kid whose family owned the coolest thing a person could own in the early 80s, an actual free-play Galaga arcade cabinet. Despite owning the object of my childhood obsession, I eventually went home one day around age 4 and told my mom I didn't like the kid next door and didn't want to go over there anymore. A huge deal, considering I was banishing myself from Galaga Haven. At the time, I lacked the language to express why I didn't like it over there, but had I been able, I'd have explained how the kid gave me bad feelings, was oddly emotionally cold and kind of mean, and seemingly lacked any sense of empathy. Even as a little kid, the neighbor boy struck me as a little off, and I trusted that feeling, and my mom trusted me, so I never went back. Anyway, about a decade later, the kid shot both his parents, stole their car, and led the cops on a high-speed pursuit. When I found out, which is its own amusing story, I was not surprised at all. I called it at age 4, so the moral here is to always trust your gut, especially when it's telling you to get away from somebody. That gut instinct really knows no age, so I'm sorry that it happened, but glad you were able to identify that feeling, even if you didn't have the words, at such an early age. Worked at an ISP company a few years back. One of the guys there was nice enough, not overly forced nice, just nice enough, friendly to newcomers, etc. We worked together for over 2 years. At work events, Christmas parties, work dinners, etc., he fit in quite well. Out of the blue, he stops showing up for work. Whenever someone asked about him, our supervisors would just look awkward and change the subject. A few weeks later, his face is all over the news. Turns out, he raped over 40 women in my city over the course of a year. We were all shocked, especially some of the ladies in the office. Overall, he seemed to be a normal guy. Truthfully, it felt normal because of the environment I grew up in. Here, everyone knows someone like that. It gets frustrating, though, when you realize that it's not normal and it is disgusting. Like, it genuinely took me to hearing about normal people's experience through life and reactions to those sorts of things to realize that something is fundamentally wrong. However, these things are normal in certain neighborhoods or high-crime cities. I worked at a factory situated in a farm community that used lots of temp workers on work release. Some were just local screw-ups from county jail, but many were big-time screw-ups, finishing prison time for some pretty bad crimes. A lot of the prison workers were there from the inner city and had been doing time for your usual inner city stuff, gangbanging, armed robbery, drugs, et al. At one point, though, we ended up with some real heavy-duty people, and they all got put on the production line I was in charge of, and all were from rural or suburban areas, I might add. 2 were from the women's prison, and both were attempted murderesses. One had tried to hire an old high school friend to murder her lawyer husband and throw his body out of his plane. There was a 2020 segment about her. She'd offered to pay him some paltry amount of money and have sex with him or something. He went to the cops, and they busted her in a sting. I remember she was super hot, nice and soft-spoken, but had some killer breath, no pun intended. The other woman had gotten drunk and stabbed her husband in the heart with a butcher's knife while her kids watched. He was recording her with a camera at the time for a custody battle. She called an ambulance for him, and he somehow lived. The family had posted the attack video on YouTube when she was about to get out, but it's since been taken down. The footage stopped right as the knife came down. She was also the last kind of person you'd suspect of doing shit like that. The other one was a guy who'd been in prison for raping his niece who was under 14, and he kept getting sent back in for being caught with kiddie porn. He had serious mental health issues and would stand next to his machine and cry big crazy tears, and he always wore Hawaiian shirts. I googled him and found out he'd once attacked a fellow inmate in the lunchroom for calling Woody Allen a pervert. I had all 3 people under my lead at once, and the company issued all these people scissors and razors each morning and left me to motivate them. Fun times. Next time you buy Clorox wipes, just think about who might have made them. Relative turned out to have raped his girlfriend's daughter. He was hiding in his parents' house, and I had met him during that time period. His parents were, in my eyes, at the time so strict with him telling not to wander outside even though he was an adult. He was skittish, and there were some red flags I didn't notice until after the fact. He was arrested and was supposed to go to court, but he was killed while he was held up. I suspect someone leaked info about him. I'm sure many of us would call what happened to him justice. A terrible case and terrible scenario, but what do you guys think about the law protecting every criminal until proven guilty? Mine isn't quite this severe, but one of my mentors growing up was 10 years older than the rest of us. He was part of the local musician community and, in all honesty, a sublime songwriter. We were friends, and I looked up to him, even though he did have his way of being a huge dickbag. Decades later, I come to find out he had been grooming his friend's 15-year-old sister. He was 30 at the time. The knowledge had soiled a great many memories that I had held damn near sacred. It's hard to explain, but our musician community is the closest thing to church I'd ever really experienced. It meant the world to me. I spent my entire adult life searching for something half as wonderful as that, and never finding it. So for him to have been doing these things behind the scenes, it just cuts extra deep. Back when I was a teenager, there was this guy who was into skydiving and was always wearing military fatigues. He was older than us, and he had this crazy look in his eyes. I wasn't comfortable around him, but he wasn't a threat because we liked rock music and so did he. I even remember him protecting some of the kids from some wannabe skinheads. A couple of years later, he was involved in a robbery where the cashier girl was shot dead. Later, I read in a local paper that it wasn't him who pulled the trigger. He went to prison, and I've never seen them again. My biological grandfather was a rapist, and so is his son, my uncle. My biological grandfather raped my mom when she was 8 and forced her to do sexual things with my uncle sporadically over the next few years. He raped my grandma when they were married. My grandma told me some details and some of the things he forced her to do. I would feel sick even typing. He also had 3 children with his second wife. His third wife was 15 when they had their first child, and my mom was 13. My uncle apparently tried abducting me when I was a toddler, and we know that he's a pedophile. He had a child with a 16-year-old girl when he was nearly 40. When I was a toddler, I guess my mom, grandma, stepdad, and uncle had a bonfire with me and my sister around. My mom was tending to my sister, and grandma was drunk. When my stepdad realized he hadn't seen me or my uncle, he found him leading me into a nearby cornfield alone. I think we can read between the lines to what his intentions were. Anyway, what it was like knowing them. I saw my bio grandfather once a year, but I didn't know his relation to me until I was 13. We had a big family reunion for a weekend every year where we all camped out in the middle of nowhere together. He was allowed because no one could tell great-grandma no, but everyone would warn the little girls not to go anywhere alone and not to talk to him. The 2 times I actually interacted with him, he just gave me major creeps. I don't know how to explain it, but he just seemed gross. As for my uncle, I don't know why my mom kept bringing him around. I guess trauma bond? She hoped he could be well one day? Anyway, even from a young age, he always seemed way too interested in me, my sister, and my cousin, his daughter. I always found myself wanting to get away from him. My sister and my cousin too. He tried to give us alcohol at our party family reunions when we were young, like 10 and 11. When I became a teenager, every time I saw him, he seemed vaguely flirty, and it made me sick. He hit on my then girlfriend the first time we met her, when he was 47 and she was 22. Then he asked her age, and was clearly disappointed when she answered 22. He had thought she was 17 or 18. All in all, learning about what they did not surprise me one bit. My friend and I loved guns growing up. We would drag things out of the house and blow them away with a shotgun. One friend built a trap shooting thingamabob. In middle school, we had a BB gun fight. Just a love affair with guns. With one of my friends, it went deeper though. Guns were part of his life. He studied them. He was also the kind of guy that, though he didn't get in fights often, would go the extra mile to make sure the fight was over. You really didn't want him in a fight broke out in a bar or a party, because he'd have your back. But you always felt like somebody might end up on a ventilator. He became a sniper, and I hear he did very well at it. I lost touch with him, but I understand he's still in some sort of military contractor. If he hadn't joined the military, I'm sure he would have found another outlet. Great guy, but he was always going to end up killing people. Well, he loved a thing, and he found a legal and some would say morally acceptable result and job for it, so good, right? Starting in my teens and into my 20s, I worked in a warehouse with a much older guy who had done 10 years in prison for killing a police officer when he was younger. I found out about his past after knowing him a few years, but learning it didn't change our relationship much. I heard from other guys that he still had a temper and could be violent, but never saw it myself. We weren't friends, but I joked and swapped stories with him, much the same as I did with my other older coworkers. I can remember wondering why he wasn't still in prison, but I never heard the full story of the crime itself. For a decent amount of time in my town, there was back-to-back drive-by shootings in my general neighborhood. A young mom who had just given birth not even 6 months ago was caught in the crossfire, shot through the window. Town went into a frenzy. The main suspect was a guy who was very well known amongst all crowds. He was involved in every shooting that happened in the area. He was the one that shot her. He was going after people he had beef with. Shot her while aiming for one of the men that was in that house at the time. We all found out it was him. No one was shocked. We don't expect less of him. He's been a felon since early high school years. He dated my friends, knew him decently well. He was always a mildly violent person, especially with his words. We all rooted for him to improve, instead kept falling down the rabbit hole of gangs and violence, never showed improvement, leading up to the events that occurred.